Since our father passed away a few weeks ago, my sisters and I have heard more than once, "I did not know Frank did that." Well, there were a lot of things we have learned over the last few months, so we thought it best to give you a summary of Frank Blair's life. Frank was born on May 21st, 1922, in Waterbury, Connecticut. He was the only child of Oscar and Jane Blair. Waterbury is best known for a company that used to be called the Waterbury Clock Company. Now it's this small watch company called Timex. I think many people living in Waterbury worked at the clock factory. Dad used to tell me about his Aunt Peg, who got very sick from licking the paint brushes used to paint the numbers of the clock dials. The paint had radon in it. These radon girls were some of the first people to suffer from radiation sickness. Dad had an enjoyable childhood. He spent many of his summers at a lake called Lake Poketapaw. At first we thought he was joking, but there really is a Lake Poketapaw. I'm not really sure where he went to grade school, but we found his report card from Crosby High School in Waterbury. He was a pretty good student, although he struggled with algebra. What surprised us the most, that he took cooking for 2 years. Cooking? We thought Dad's idea of cooking was pouring a can of soup into a saucepan. Dad graduated from high school in June 1940. Although not confirmed, we think he went to college right away at the University of New Hampshire after graduating from high school. What we do know is that he was an interventionist. Let me explain that. The war in Europe had started way before the Pacific conflict. Dad was already a rebel in his late teens, as he wanted the United States to intervene in the European conflict. That was not the majority opinion of people in those days. It's strange to talk about Dad wanting the United States to go to war, but we all know now that it was the right fight. In 1942, after Pearl Harbor, Dad enlisted in the Navy. He wanted to be on the ships, but ended up spending very little time on them. Instead, Dad was a communications expert. He was the radio operator for flights of the Naval Air Service. Thankfully, the flights he participated in were not combat, but important nevertheless. His flights were transportation of supplies to the military units, and many flights were for evacuation of wounded from the battlefields back to the military bases where the hospitals were located. He had many bases, including Honolulu, Guam, and Okinawa. The experiences he had during his service really shaped his life. He was very proud of his service and the men and women who fought in the war, but he also knew firsthand the death and brutality that war can bring. Having developed rheumatic fever, Dad returned to the States in 1946, and he finished his tour in Jacksonville, Florida. He eventually went back to school at the University of New Hampshire. His major was English, and he continued his interest in radio by joining the radio station of the university, a group called Mike and Dial. He ended up doing radio publicity for the school's drama department. It was through this that he met our mother, Jean Mary Durant. Mom was an actress and was in many of the university's drama productions. Our mom and Dad dated for about 2.5 years. Dad graduated in 1949, and Mom and Dad got married a few weeks after that. They had a beautiful wedding on June 25th, 1949. Our parents moved to Skokie, Illinois after graduation. Mom was a teacher, and Dad went to graduate school at Northwestern. He worked with children with speech and hearing disorders. The children he worked with varied from hearing impaired to kids with autism. He received his master's degree from Northwestern in 1951 and his doctorate degree in 1955. It was also during this time that he worked as one of the chief audiologists at the Eye and Ear Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In the fall of 1956, Dad was hired as an assistant professor at Kent State University. He worked at Kent State before anyone had ever heard of it. Mom and Dad continued to have close ties with Pittsburgh as they adopted Elizabeth, my older sister Betsy, from an orphanage in that city in 1957. In 1960, our father left Kent State University to work at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. Unfortunately, his time at Vanderbilt was short-lived, as he was only there for a year. Fortunately, however, I was blessed with being adopted as their second child. I was named after a close friend of my mom's, Amy, who worked at the hospital where Mom volunteered. Mom, Dad, Betsy, and I moved up to Milwaukee shortly after my adoption in 1961. Our dad had been offered an opportunity to open a school for the hearing impaired and aphasic at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In 1963, Mom and Dad adopted their third daughter, my younger sister, Kate. The late 1960s were a time of turmoil and chaos, not only in Milwaukee, but in our nation. Both our parents became very involved in many of the social causes of that era: anti-Vietnam War, civil rights, fair housing, and justice for the poor. Mom was an organizer. Being the group's president, she would set up speakers for the UWM Women's League, or she assisted in coordinating symposiums at a local church. Dad, however, was the rebel, participating in marches, various protests, or working with members of the Milwaukee 14. Our house during this time was very lively with many visitors. It was not unusual to have some radical priest in our living room saying Mass. We would bake some leaded whole wheat communion bread that could break your toe if you dropped it. And that's not to say that our lives were all about protesting. Our parents wanted my sisters and I to have many experiences, and we traveled a lot during the summers. We were lucky. We usually were able to go someplace new: Washington, D.C., the Badlands of South Dakota, Seattle. But we always went to Webster Lake in New Hampshire. We would rent a vacation home for a week or so and reconnect with my mom and dad's families. Looking back, I'm sure it reminded him of his days as a boy vacationing at Lake Poketapaw. Another constant in our lives were our pet animals: birds, gerbils, and cats. Lots of cats. Mom and Dad were especially fond of Siamese, definitely an acquired taste. From our earliest memories, Mom and Dad had Gabby, a Siamese cat who was very appropriately named. Nicky and Sparky were Siamese, who were hissing at each other one moment, then cuddling the next. The Siamese were the male companionship Dad had in a house full of girls. And then there was Maggie. She was the one that broke the mold. She had suffered a stroke after eating a poisonous plant. Maggie survived, although with some brain damage that caused her to run into walls and thump the dishwasher. The Vietnam War ended, thankfully, and the civil rights demonstrations stopped. Mom and Dad remained involved in advocacy in many circles. Meanwhile, our Grandma Blair, who had Parkinson's disease, moved to Milwaukee as her health was failing and she was alone. Dad spent a lot of time attending to her needs. In 1984, Mom passed away after a long struggle battling leukemia. Dad retired from UW-Milwaukee shortly after her death. He was awarded the status of Professor Emeritus upon his retirement. I think it is safe to say that Dad secluded himself after Mom died. He wasn't a joiner, and he would frequently say, "Oh, I don't like crowds." But he kept in contact with many of his friends he had come to know through his work with the peace and justice community. Friends like Nick Riddell, Jim Groppe, Dismas Becker, Larry Rosbaugh, just to name a few. He also developed a strong bond with his dear friends Dee and Deedon Hayden. Dad decided to remain in his home, and soon a cat named Babe adopted him. They lived together for many years. We remember seeing Babe sitting on the table, sharing a Kringle with Dad. I don't think Mom would have approved of that. He developed a passion for photography and took many photos of flowers, and lakes, and flowers, and trees, and flowers. Oh, and did I mention that he liked to take pictures of flowers? Dad really loved being a grandfather. Adam was born in 1988, Mike and Jeff in 1993, and Stephen in 1995. And then he found a new interest, the internet. He got his first computer in 1996, but really started blogging, probably in about the year 2001. It would take Dad some time to learn the computer, but once he did, he couldn't stop. Initially, it seemed like he would write every day. It probably wasn't that much, but it could feel like it. As his health was failing, it was harder for him to sit and write his thoughts. But he still had his opinions and his desire to reach out to people through his writings. On July 5th, 2011, he wrote an email to Betsy at approximately 10:15 in the morning. He was found passed away at his computer table at about 6:30 that night. He likely passed away quickly. He died in front of his computer, something that gave him a lot of joy. We are blessed with the fact that although he was tired, he lived a full life to the end. As I write this and think about our dad's life, I am truly in awe of the life he had. He was 89. He lived through the Depression. He lived through a world war. He lived through a world that communicated with Morse code to a world that communicates with computers and cell phones. He lived in a nation from times when a black person was forced to sit at the back of a bus to a nation where discrimination is illegal and we have a black president. He has lived in a world where he raised 3 daughters and went on to see the birth of 4 grandsons. Our dad's life is a wonderful story. Thank you for letting me share it with you.